She stood at the center of the great hall, and not one person in the room could look away. The Alpha Council chamber was carved from dark stone, lit by torches that threw long shadows across the faces of men who had decided the fates of entire packs. 6 elders sat in a half-circle behind a raised oak table. The Alpha himself sat at the head, still, unreadable, his silver-streaked hair the only sign that age had ever touched him at all. And in the middle of the floor, alone, stood Sarah. She was 22 years old. She wore no rank markings. No pack crest. Just a quiet steadiness behind her eyes that made her look more dangerous than the armed sentinels posted at every door. She manipulated this family. The voice came from the left side of the chamber. Caden, the eldest son, broad-shouldered and furious, stepped forward from the row of brothers. She has been working toward this moment since the day our father brought her through our gates. Everything she did, every act of loyalty, it was calculated. It was performance. The chamber was silent except for the snap of the torches. Then, from the right side, "That's a lie, and you know it." Roan, the second son, didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You want her gone because her presence changes things. Not for us. For you." Caden's jaw tightened. "This is exactly what I mean." "Enough." One word. From the Alpha. Both sons went still. He didn't look at them. He looked at Sarah. And whatever passed between them in that moment, whatever years of memory and grief and quiet devotion lived inside that single glance, he kept it locked behind his expression. Sarah held his gaze. She did not look away. And if you had been watching closely, you would have noticed that her hands were perfectly calm at her sides. She had known this day was coming. She had been preparing for it her entire life. But to understand why she stood there, to understand what the 4 brothers were truly fighting about, and what the Alpha's silence meant, you have to go back. Back 12 years. Before we go back 12 years, take a second to subscribe if you enjoy immersive storytelling like this. Every like and comment helps these stories reach more people. And tell me in the comments, if you had found that wounded wolf in the storm, would you have stopped to help, or kept walking? Keep that answer in mind, because Sarah's choice that night changed everything. She was 10 years old, and she had learned very early that the world did not make room for her. Her name was Sarah. No surname. No pack. Her parents were gone before she was old enough to hold their faces clearly in her memory. Fever took her mother, and her father had simply never returned from a patrol one winter. No one ever told her what had happened to him. No one had thought she deserved an explanation. She lived at the edge of Ironvale territory, in a leaning shed that had once been used for tool storage. The pack that claimed the land tolerated her the way people tolerate a weed. They didn't pull her up, but they didn't water her either. She was fed when there was excess. She was forgotten when there wasn't. She gathered roots near the tree line. She trapped small animals with wire snares she'd taught herself to build. She carried water from the creek in a tin bucket with a bent handle, making the trip twice in the morning and twice in the evening, because the alternative was thirst. She did all of this without complaint. Not because she wasn't lonely, she was, deeply, but because she had decided somewhere along the way that survival required a kind of silence. Not the silence of giving up. The silence of someone who was still watching. Still waiting. Still certain, in some quiet and unshakable part of herself, that the waiting would eventually mean something. She had no one to tell her she was right. She told herself anyway. The storm came in the 3rd week of autumn. It moved fast, the way the worst ones always do. The sky went from gray to black between one breath and the next, and by the time the rain hit, it hit sideways, cold and biting, with a wind that bent the old trees at the creek's edge nearly to the ground. Sarah had been coming back from her evening water run when she heard it. Not the storm. Something underneath the storm. A sound low enough that a person standing 10 feet away might not have caught it at all. But she had spent years learning to pay attention to sounds that didn't belong, the crack of a branch that meant someone was moving nearby, the absence of birdsong that meant a predator was close. She had trained herself to notice. She stopped. She set down the bucket. And she pushed through the wet undergrowth toward the sound. He was lying at the base of a fallen oak, half concealed by a tangle of exposed roots. A wolf, massive, the largest she had ever seen, with fur so dark it was nearly impossible to separate him from the shadows around him. He was breathing. She could see that. But his breaths were shallow and uneven, and there was blood soaking the ground beneath him, black in the darkness, spreading too wide, spreading too fast. She knew what this looked like. She had nursed an injured dog back to health once, 2 summers ago, a stray she'd found near the road. She had learned what dying looked like, and she had learned what almost dying looked like, and this wolf was somewhere in the dangerous space between them. She did not know who he was. She had no way of knowing. Out here, alone, in the dark, in the rain, he was just a creature in pain. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the walk home. She thought about her one dry blanket and the small fire she'd been planning to light. She thought about the risk. A wounded animal could be unpredictable, could turn on her without warning, and if something happened to her out here in the storm, no one would come looking. She thought about all of it. Then she knelt down beside him in the mud, put her small hand gently against his side, and felt his ribs rise and fall beneath her palm. "Okay," she said quietly, to him or to herself or to no one in particular. "I've got you." She did not know, as she said it, that those 3 words would change the shape of her entire life. She did not know who she was kneeling beside. But somewhere in the months that followed, you will begin to wonder, as she eventually would, whether the wolf had somehow always known who she was. Whether being found by her, in that moment, in that storm, was the kind of accident the universe doesn't actually allow. Getting him to shelter took her the better part of an hour. She couldn't move him directly, he was far too large, far too heavy, and when she tried to shift his weight, he made a sound low in his chest that told her clearly enough to stop. So instead she worked around him. She went back to the shed and returned with her single blanket, a length of rope she used for drying clothes, and the tin cup she used for drinking water. She built a rough lean-to against the fallen oak using branches and mud-packed leaves, not perfect but enough to break the worst of the wind and rain. She used the blanket to cover the worst of his injuries. Then she stayed. She fed him water slowly, pouring it near his muzzle and letting him take it at his own pace. She found the gash along his flank, long and deep, not from a fall, she realized almost immediately. The edges were too clean. This was a blade wound. Someone had cut him deliberately, and they had known what they were doing. She cleaned it with what she had, rainwater, a strip of cloth torn from the bottom of her shirt, and she pressed it closed with steady hands and bound it with a rope, not too tight, just enough to hold. She sat with him through the rest of the storm. She talked to him, sometimes, not about anything in particular. About the roots she'd found that morning. About how she thought the creek might flood before morning. About how she'd once seen a hawk catch a fish midair over the water and had thought about it almost every day since because it had been the most extraordinary thing she'd ever seen and there had been no one to tell. He couldn't respond. But he listened. She was almost certain of that. His breathing steadied sometime in the small hours of the night, and by dawn, when the storm had thinned to a gray drizzle, his eyes were open. They were gold. A shade of gold she had never seen in an animal's eyes before, clear and deep, like light through amber. He watched her. And she looked back at him without flinching. "You're going to be all right," she told him. "I won't let anything happen to you." It was a bold thing for a 10-year-old girl with no pack and no power and no one in the world to say to a creature she didn't know. She meant every word. Over the days that followed, she built a careful routine around him. She brought food, whatever she could spare, which was never much, but she divided it without hesitation. Half for her, half for him, and on the days she'd caught something decent in the snares, she let him have the larger portion. She told herself it was because he was healing and needed more. She did not examine the feeling too closely, the strange sense of purpose that had settled into her chest since the night she'd found him. The feeling that, for the first time in as long as she could remember, there was somewhere she was supposed to be. She watched him get stronger. She watched him watch her. There was something unnerving about it, not frightening, but weighted. The way his eyes tracked her movements when she came close. The way he was never fully still when she was near, always subtly alert, as though her presence required his full attention. She had lived her whole life being overlooked. Being the subject of that kind of focus felt strange. She wasn't entirely sure she didn't like it. On the fourth day, he shifted. She had stepped outside to check the snares, and when she came back, he was no longer a wolf. She stopped in the doorway. He was a man. Sitting with his back against the wall, the makeshift bandage still wrapped around his ribs, his gold eyes watching her from across the small space. He was older than her father would have been, if her father had lived. Silver at his temples. A jaw that looked like it had been cut from stone. He held himself with the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades being the most powerful person in every room he entered, and had long since stopped needing to prove it. He looked at her like he had been expecting her to come back. Like he had no doubt she would. "You know what I am," he said. It wasn't a question. Sarah swallowed. "I do now." There was a pause. "You could have left me in the forest." "Yes," she said simply. "Why didn't you?" She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything, careful, unhurried, unwilling to give him something that wasn't true. "Because you needed someone," she finally said. "And I was there." He was quiet for a long time after that. When his warriors found him the following morning, a search party of 12, armed, exhausted, having spent 6 days combing every inch of the territory, they found their alpha sitting upright, alert, and in better condition than any of them had expected. They found him in a child's shelter, on the edge of packed territory, beside a 10-year-old orphan girl who handed them back the alpha's warmth with dirt on her knees and no idea that the world she'd known was about to end. The head warrior looked at her. Then at the alpha. Then back at her. "Should we?" "She comes with us," the alpha said. He said it the way he said everything, as though the matter had already been decided long before he'd opened his mouth. As though this too had simply been waiting to be named. Sarah looked up at him. For the first time in years, something behind her ribs loosened. Not all the way. But enough. She picked up her tin bucket. She followed. She didn't know yet what it would mean. She didn't know about the 4 sons waiting inside those gates, or the years of tension and rivalry and complicated love that were already gathering at the edges of her future like a storm she couldn't yet see. She didn't know that one day she would stand before the Alpha Council, with a family divided around her, and that everything, would come down to what the Alpha chose to say. But she was 10 years old, and she had just learned that choosing compassion in the dark was its own kind of power. The rest would come in time. He left without ceremony. One morning she woke and he was gone, his warriors with him, the ground around the lean-to still marked with boot prints and the flattened grass where 12 men had stood. She had known he would go. A man like that didn't belong in a child's makeshift shelter at the edge of packed territory. He had a seat of power to return to, decisions waiting, people who needed him in ways she couldn't fully imagine. She told herself it didn't matter. She went back to her routine. Checked the snares. Made the water runs. Sat in the quiet of the shed at night and listened to the forest settle around her. She told herself this was fine. This was what she knew. This was enough. She almost believed it. He came back 9 days later. She heard them before she saw them, the sound of horses, the low murmur of voices carrying through the trees, and when she stepped outside, shading her eyes against the morning light, she counted 6 figures moving along the tree line toward her. Not warriors this time. Not armed men in patrol formation. The Alpha himself, in a dark riding coat, with 2 elders flanking him on horseback and 3 pack witnesses she didn't recognize, a term she didn't even know yet but would shortly learn, because everything about this morning was about to teach her something she hadn't been prepared for. He carried a leather satchel. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her the way he had looked at her from across the shelter floor when he was still healing, steady, unhurried, certain. "I told you that you were coming with me," he said. Sarah looked at the elders. At the witnesses. At the satchel in his hand. "I thought that was just for that morning." "No." He opened the satchel and drew out a folded document, heavy paper with a wax seal already pressed into its lower corner. He held it out to her. It was permanent. She took the paper with both hands. She unfolded it slowly. She could read. She had taught herself using old pages she'd salvaged from a rubbish pile 2 winters ago, sounding words out in private until they stopped being obstacles. So she read what was written on the document in front of her, and then she read it again, because the first time her brain had simply refused to accept it. Adoption. Her name, written in formal pack script. His name beside it. Pack witnesses. The seal of Ironvale. She looked up. "You don't know me," she said. It was the only coherent thing she could find. "I know enough." He said it without hesitation. "I know what you did in the dark, when there was nothing in it for you. That tells me more about a person than years of acquaintance usually manage to." He paused. "I have been watching people my whole life, Sarah. I know what I saw." The elders behind him were quiet in the way people are quiet when they disapprove of something but have already lost the argument. She looked down at the paper again. Her name. Followed by his. She had not had a surname in 10 years. Her hands were not entirely steady when she refolded the document. "All right," she said. The objections began before she cleared the gate. She heard them in fragments as she walked through Ironvale for the first time, voices dropping when she passed, then rising again behind her, conversations she was clearly not meant to overhear but that no one was particularly careful about concealing. An outsider. A nobody. An orphan child from the edge of the territory. The noble families were the loudest. 3 of them sent formal representatives to the Alpha's hall within hours of her arrival, requesting an audience, requesting clarification, requesting, though they phrased it more delicately, that he reconsider. She was not Ironvale-born. She carried no bloodline. She had no rank, no history, no value they could identify. Bringing her into the Alpha family was not tradition. It was not strategy. It made no sense to any of them. The elders convened without being asked and delivered a collective statement, carefully worded, respectfully firm. This decision carried risks they felt duty-bound to name. Senior warriors, men who had bled for the pack and the Alpha both, asked each other quietly in the training yard what exactly had happened out there in the forest. What the girl had done to earn this. Whether the Alpha had taken a blow to the head that no one had accounted for. The Alpha listened to all of it. He listened with the particular patience of a man who has long since learned that hearing people out costs him nothing, and that very little of what people say in the first hour of a crisis reflects what they actually believe in the second. When they were finished, he said, "She stays." 2 words. Final. No elaboration offered, none invited. And the thing about the Alpha, the thing Sarah would come to understand slowly, over years, was that his silences were never empty. They were decisions. Every time he chose not to explain himself, it was because he had already decided the explanation was unnecessary. He had earned enough trust, and enough fear, that when he drew a line, people stepped back from it. Not always gracefully. Not always without resentment. But they stepped back. She stayed. She met the sons that first evening. The Alpha brought her to the main hall at dusk, when the long table was set for dinner and the torches were lit and the whole room smelled of wood smoke and meat and the kind of permanent, settled order that comes from a household that has run the same way for decades. He introduced her without fanfare, simply, directly, the way he did everything. "This is Sarah," he said. "She is my daughter now. Treat her accordingly." Then he sat down and reached for his cup, and left the four of them to do whatever they were going to do with that information. The eldest son, Caden, was standing at the far end of the table, and he did not sit. He was 24, tall and broad in the same way his father was broad, with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of face that had already settled into authority while he was still young enough to resent how much work it required. He was going to lead this pack someday. He had been preparing for that his entire life, every training session, every council meeting he'd been permitted to observe, every decision he'd watched his father make and quietly catalogued and analyzed in the private hours before sleep. He was ready. He had been ready for years. He looked at Sarah the way he looked at every variable he hadn't accounted for, carefully, without warmth, already calculating what she changed. He said nothing. He sat down. He began eating. That was its own kind of answer. Across the table, the second son, Roan, was watching her with an expression that was harder to read than his brother's because it moved. He was 21, built like someone who had decided early that his body was a weapon and had spent every year since refining it. There were old scars on his forearms, pale lines that spoke to a training regimen most people would have stopped well before acquiring them. He was competitive in the way that runs deep, not performative, not for an audience, but the kind that lives in the chest and drives a person out of bed an hour before sunrise to do something everyone else considers optional. He looked at Sarah. Then at his father. Then back at Sarah, with a measuring quality, the way you measure something that might one day be competition. "How old are you?" he asked. 10, she said. He nodded once, as though this confirmed something he'd already decided. Then he went back to his food. The third son, Eli, hadn't moved from the chair he was sitting in when they entered, which was set slightly apart from the table, angled toward the window, with a book open across his knee that he had apparently been reading before they arrived. He was 17, with the kind of quietness that wasn't shyness but focus, the quietness of someone whose mind is simply somewhere else most of the time, running calculations, building theories, filing away details. He had noticed her the moment she walked through the door. She could tell from the way his eyes had tracked the movement, even though his head hadn't lifted. He noticed everything. He just didn't always let on. He looked at her now with open, interested attention, the way a person looks at something genuinely new. "You were the one who found him," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "In the storm." "Yes." He tilted his head slightly. "What made you stop?" Most people would have kept walking. Sarah considered him. Most people hadn't already decided to stop. Something shifted in his expression, a micro-movement, gone almost before it registered, but she caught it. He was reassessing. She filed that away without knowing quite why. "Interesting," he said quietly. He looked back at his book, but she noticed he didn't turn a page for the rest of the meal. The fourth son said nothing at all. He was sitting at the very end of the table, slightly removed, in the particular way of someone who has practiced making themselves peripheral in spaces where they don't want to be. 14 years old, with sharp eyes and a mouth that was set in a line that could have been sullenness or grief or something more complicated that hadn't found a name for itself yet. He was the youngest. He had been the youngest for 14 years in a house full of brothers who were all louder and more defined than he was, and he had learned, the way youngest children sometimes do, to make absence into armor. He looked at Sarah once, direct and quick, then looked away. He didn't look back for the rest of the evening. But she noticed that he didn't leave the table, either. He stayed through the whole meal in a household where she would later learn he regularly disappeared before dessert. She tucked that away somewhere quiet. That night, alone in the room they'd given her, a real room, with a real bed and a window that looked out over the training yard, she sat on the edge of the mattress and held the folded adoption document in both hands. She thought about the four of them. The heir who hadn't spoken to her. The warrior who had measured her and found her category. The scholar who had asked her a question and actually listened to the answer. The youngest, who had stayed. She thought about the years ahead. About what it would mean to live inside this family, to carry this name, to grow up in the space between four brothers who hadn't asked for a sister and an alpha who had decided she was one anyway. She didn't know yet which of them would come to matter most to her. She didn't know which one she would fight with longest, or protect most fiercely, or sit beside in the dark when the nights were hard. She didn't know what she was going to cost any of them, or what they were going to give her in return. She only knew that somewhere out there, the council hall was waiting. That one day she would stand in the center of it, alone, with the family divided around her. She knew that much. For now, it was enough to be inside the walls. For now, it was enough to have a door that closed and a name that was hers and a window to watch the stars through. She lay down. She folded the document carefully and placed it on the nightstand where she could see it. She slept, for the first time in years, without keeping one ear open for sounds in the dark. The first month was the hardest. Not because anyone was cruel to her, cruelty would have been familiar, something she knew how to move around. What she hadn't prepared for was the particular weight of being visible in a place where she didn't yet know the rules. In the shed at the edge of the territory, her ignorance had only ever cost her. Here, it cost other people's patience, and that was somehow worse. She sat in the wrong seat at the morning table. She addressed an elder by his given name before she knew that wasn't done. She wore her hair loose on a ceremonial day when every woman in the pack covered hers, and she only realized it when she saw them looking, not unkindly, but with the particular sadness people reserve for someone who has made a mistake they could have prevented if only someone had thought to warn them. No one had thought to warn her. She learned the customs the way she had learned everything else in her life, by watching, by listening, by making the error once and never making it again. She studied the pack the way Eli studied his books, systematically, without ego, taking nothing personally. This was how things were done. She would learn how things were done. That was all. But at night, alone in her room with the door closed, she sat on the edge of the bed and felt the strangeness of it press down on her, the silence of a house that was full of people who didn't need her, who had been complete before she arrived and remained complete now that she was here, and who regarded her with a range of feelings that ran from cautious tolerance to barely concealed resentment, with very little in between. She pressed her palms flat against her knees and breathed slowly. She had survived worse, she reminded herself. She told herself that until it felt true. It was Ron who found her in the training yard at dawn on the 9th day. She had woken early, old habit, impossible to break, and wandered out in the gray pre-sunrise quiet, not quite knowing what to do with herself in a house where she had no chores yet and no clear place to be. The training yard was empty. The weapons rack was unlocked. She had stood in front of it for a long moment, then picked up the lightest staff she could find, because holding something gave her hands somewhere to go. She had no idea what she was doing. She made that clear immediately when she swung it and nearly took out her own knee. Ron appeared at the yard gate with his arms crossed, watching. She stopped. Lowered the staff. Waited for him to say something dismissive. He said, "Your grip is wrong. You're holding it like a broom. I've never held one of these before." "I know." He walked across the yard and held out his hand. She gave him the staff. He adjusted his own grip on it, slowly, so she could see where his hands were placed. "Like this. Not tight, you're not trying to choke it. Feel the balance point first before you try to move it." She took it back. Adjusted her grip. "Better," he said. Not warmly, but accurately. He came back the next morning. And the morning after that. He never explained why. He didn't offer encouragement in any form she recognized, no praise, no reassurance, no patience with repetition beyond what was mechanically necessary. What he gave her instead was something more useful. He treated her like she was capable of learning. He corrected her without softening the correction. He pushed her pace when she plateaued. He showed her things a second time without making her feel that needing a second time was a failing. She understood, eventually, that this was how he expressed regard. It was the only currency he trusted. She worked harder than she needed to, because she found that she didn't want to waste what he was offering. Months later, Sarah would realize those mornings in the training yard had been preparing her for something none of them yet understood. Eli came to her differently. 3 weeks in, she had been sitting at the long table in the library. She hadn't known it was called the library, she'd thought it was just the room with the shelves, trying to decipher a map of packed territories that someone had left open, when he came in without knocking, stopped when he saw her, and then continued toward his usual chair as though she were simply part of the furniture. He sat down. Opened a book. Read in silence for 10 minutes. Then, without looking up, "You're reading the map upside down." She looked at it. Rotated it. The creek she'd been trying to locate snapped into sense. "Thank you," she said. "The coastal border markers are outdated," he continued, still reading. "That map was made before the Veldran annexation. Don't use it for anything current." "I wasn't using it for anything current." "What were you using it for?" She hesitated. "I was trying to understand where I came from. Geographically. Where the edge of the territory actually sits in relation to everything else." He looked up then. He looked at her with that careful, measuring attention that had characterized their first meeting. "You'd been living on the border for years and you didn't know?" "I knew the forest," she said. "I didn't know the maps." He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood, went to a different shelf, and came back with a newer map, which he spread across the table in front of her without ceremony. "This one is current. The pack boundary runs here." He pointed. "This is where the shed was, roughly here. And this," his finger moved, "is where he was found." She studied it. "He was far from home," she said. "Yes," Eli said. "He was." He sat back down. He went back to his book. But after that, he started leaving volumes on the table when he knew she'd be in the library, history, mostly, pack law, geography. Never with a note. Never with any acknowledgement that he'd done it. She read every one of them and put them back exactly where she'd found them, and neither of them ever mentioned it directly. It was, she came to understand, his version of a door being left open. Caden's hostility was not loud. That was the thing about it that made it hard to address, it didn't give her anything to push against. He was never rude to her in any way she could name. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ignore her in front of others. He observed every formal requirement of treating her as part of the household, because Caden did everything required of him with absolute precision, and what was required of him was to accept his father's decision. He accepted it. He simply made sure she understood, in the space between every interaction, in the precise measure of distance he kept, in the way his gaze moved past her rather than to her, in the way he never once, in all those months, asked her a single question, that his acceptance was a discipline he was exercising over himself. Not a thing he felt. She understood the distinction. She respected it, even. It was honest, in its way. But it sat in her chest like a stone she was learning to carry. Dane was the one she couldn't place. He was the youngest, only 4 years older than her, and he existed in the house the way weather exists, present and influential and entirely governed by conditions she couldn't yet read. Some mornings she passed him in the corridor and he looked through her. Other times she'd come around a corner to find him standing at her door with something in his hands, a book he'd clearly borrowed from Eli's shelf, once, a piece of bread from the kitchen another time, once a small carved wooden figure she didn't know what to do with, and he would hold it out without explanation, and if she hesitated even a moment, he would set it on the ground and walk away as though the transaction had been completed regardless of her participation. She kept the carved figure on the nightstand next to the adoption document. She tried several times to start a conversation with him. He answered in 1 or 2 words, never more. He didn't seem unfriendly exactly, just armored, in the particular way of someone who had been hurt in a specific place enough times to learn how to protect it without drawing attention to the injury. She recognized it because she had learned the same way. She stopped trying to pry. She simply made sure that whenever he was in the same room as her, she didn't treat his presence as unusual. She didn't remark on it. She didn't adjust her behavior around him or look at him expectantly or try to make him feel observed. She had learned, long before this house, that some people need you to make room without asking what for. The day everything changed was an ordinary one. 6 months in. Late afternoon in autumn, the pack's younger warriors running endurance drills in the outer yard while a handful of elders watched from the covered walkway. Sarah had been doing her regular training with Roan at the far end of the yard, footwork, mostly, the same sequence he'd made her repeat 400 times by now until it lived in her feet instead of her head. Roan called for a break. She reached for the water canteen near the fence post and found it knocked on its side, empty. She picked it up without thinking much about it. She turned toward the well at the yard's edge. She didn't make it 3 steps before she stopped. There was a child, one of the pack's younger children, 4 years old perhaps, who had been chasing a dog between the legs of the watching elders, and the dog had run too fast, and the child had tripped and gone down hard on the stone path near the well's edge, close enough that momentum had carried him, close enough that what happened next had a narrow, terrible margin in it. She moved before she thought. She was 15 feet away. She should not have reached him in time. She reached him in time. She caught him by the back of his shirt with one hand and hauled him back from the edge, and the shock of it ran from her palm up through her arm and into her chest like a current, like something that had been asleep had woken up all at once and didn't know what to do with itself, and when she set the child down safely on the path and straightened up, she found that everyone in the yard had gone still. Not because of the child. Because of the air around her hands. It was faint. She would have missed it entirely if she hadn't seen it reflected in their faces first, a faint luminescence, silver blue, already fading as she watched, as whatever had risen in her settled back beneath the surface like water returning to flat. It was gone in seconds. The silence in the yard lasted considerably longer. Roan was the only one who moved. He crossed the yard in a few long strides and stopped in front of her, looking at her hands, then her face. "What was that?" he said. Not a question. "I don't know," she said. It was the truth. She had never felt anything like it before. Or perhaps, and this was the thought that arrived quietly, the one she did not say aloud, perhaps she had felt it before, in smaller ways she hadn't had a name for. The way she always knew, slightly before it happened, when a storm was coming. The way the injured wolf had stilled under her hands that night, like her touch itself was something that could heal. Small things. Things she had filed away as coincidence because she had no other category for them. She looked at Roan. "I don't know," she said again. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he looked across the yard at the covered walkway, where 2 elders were no longer watching the drills. They were watching her. Questions had been gathering around her like weather for months. She could feel them in the way conversations shifted when she entered rooms. In the deliberate silences at council tables she was not yet permitted to sit at. In the way certain elders who had initially opposed her adoption had recently stopped opposing it, which should have been a relief but instead felt like something worse, like people who had decided to wait. She was 11 now, then 12, then she turned 13 in a house that celebrated her birthday with more warmth than she'd been prepared for, and still no one could tell her why she was the way she was. Because she had started to understand, slowly and without anyone confirming it, that what had happened in the training yard was not a singular event. It had happened before, differently, smaller, in forms she could excuse. And after the yard, it happened again. Once, in the library, when she was frustrated with a passage she couldn't parse, the candle beside her had flared without wind. Once, in the corridor at night, she had passed Dane's closed door and heard him moving on the other side of it in the particular way of someone in the grip of a nightmare, and without quite deciding to, she had pressed her palm flat against the wood, and the sound stopped. She had stood there for a long moment, heart going hard in her chest, then walked quickly back to her room. She had not told anyone. But she kept asking questions. Carefully, indirectly, in the way she had learned to gather information since she was old enough to understand that people don't always give you the truth if they know that's what you're looking for. Why had her father left on that patrol and never come back? She asked the elder who managed the pack's historical records, phrasing it as general curiosity about Border Patrol incidents that decade. He told her about a conflict near the Belgian border, packs clashing over territory, several deaths, nothing unusual for the time. She pressed gently. He became vague. She pressed again and he found somewhere else to be. Why had her mother come to live at the border at all? No one seemed to know, and the ones who might have known seemed to have collectively misplaced the information. Why did the record of her parents' arrival in Iron Vale territory, she had found a line, just a single line in an administrative log, why did it appear with a different surname crossed out above it and her family name written beneath, as though someone had corrected an error? Or concealed one? The evidence, when it started disappearing, disappeared quietly. That single page of the administrative log was gone the next time she looked for it. She had not imagined it, she had a good memory, better than good, trained by years of having no one to remind her of things she needed to remember, and she had read the entry twice. The page was simply not there anymore. The log ran from one entry to the next with the seamlessness of something that had always been that way. She mentioned this to Eli with careful vagueness, describing it as a page that seemed to be missing from a record she'd been reading. He went to the archive and came back with a look she hadn't seen on him before. "The binding's been disturbed," he said, quietly, because Eli was always quiet in proportion to how serious he was being. "Recently. Someone has been in those records." "When?" "Within the last 2 weeks." He paused. "What were you looking for?" She told him. Not everything, not the light from her hands, not the candle, not Dane's door. Just the crossed-out name. Just the administrative record. Just the fact that it was gone. He was quiet for a long time after that. "Don't look for it anymore," he said. "Not visibly. Let me do it." She wanted to argue. She swallowed it. "All right." He nodded. "And then, Sarah. The person who removed that page knew it was significant. Which means they knew what you'd find if you kept reading." He held her gaze. "Be careful." She wasn't the only one who had noticed. The Alpha had been watching since the day in the training yard. She knew it, the way she always knew when his attention was on her, a peripheral awareness, like knowing where the warmest part of a room is. He hadn't asked her about it directly. He hadn't asked her about any of it. But she had seen him, twice in the weeks that followed, pull elders aside for conversations that stopped the moment she came close. She had seen him spend 3 evenings in the records room with the door latched, which he never did. She had seen him write a letter and seal it himself rather than using his secretary, and give it to a writer she didn't recognize, not one of his regular messengers. He was looking for something. She knew him well enough by now to know that when he moved quietly, it was because the ground was uncertain, and uncertain ground required care. He would tell her what he found when he had found enough to tell. That was how he operated, he did not share half a truth. He waited until the shape of the thing was clear. She trusted that. She just didn't know how long the wait was going to be. The clue, when he found it, arrived in the form of a response to that sealed letter. She didn't see the letter itself. What she saw was his face when he read it. She had come to find him in his study at the usual hour and found him standing at the window with the page in his hand, facing away from her, and when he turned at the sound of her entrance, he had already composed his expression back to its default steadiness. But she was 13 years old and she had been studying this man's face with careful attention for 3 years, and she knew the difference between his ordinary stillness and the particular stillness of someone who has just had the ground shift beneath them. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Yes, he said. She looked at the letter in his hand. He folded it. Placed it face down on the desk. Have you eaten? He said. She recognized it for what it was, not deflection, but protection. He was putting something between her and information she wasn't ready for yet, the way you put your hand between a child and a flame, not to deny the heat exists, but because the timing matters. Because some things land differently when the ground is solid enough to hold them. She wanted to push. She felt it rise in her, the same stubborn, rootless hunger that had driven her to turn over every stone she could find, looking for the shape of her own origin. She let it settle. No, she said. He nodded. Come on, then. He led her to the kitchen, and they ate together at the small table that was not the formal dining table, the one that was just for the two of them sometimes, the one that felt, when she let herself feel it, like what she imagined a family was supposed to feel like. She watched him across the table. He was protecting her. From something he had just learned. Something that had made even his steadiness waver. She needed to know what it was. And she understood, sitting there watching the firelight move across his face, that she would. That he was building toward telling her. That he was gathering the courage or the words or perhaps simply the right moment, and that it was coming, as surely as any storm she had ever sensed before it arrived. She just had to wait. The waiting, at least, she knew how to do. Years have a way of doing what argument cannot. She grew, not just in height, not just in the visible, measurable ways that people remark on when they haven't seen a child in a season, but in the harder, quieter ways. The way she held a room. The way she listened. The way she moved through the pack now with the particular ease of someone who has learned a place so thoroughly that it has stopped being a place she is learning and has simply become where she lives. She was 17 when the senior warriors stopped treating her as the Alpha's charity project and started treating her as someone worth watching in the training yard. 18 when the elders began consulting her on pack boundary disputes, not because she had rank, but because she had a quality that was genuinely rare. She could hold two opposing arguments in her mind simultaneously, weigh them without attachment, and identify the point of actual conflict with a clarity that cut through hours of circular council debate in minutes. She was 19 when the pack stopped asking, privately, what the Alpha had seen in her. They had worked it out for themselves. What she had with Roan was not soft. It was 4 years of early mornings and wooden staffs and the accumulated bruises of someone who had been trained by a person who believed strongly that you learn the lesson or you learn it again, and that the repetition is not punishment, it is respect. She had argued with him more than she had argued with any of the others, and the arguments were real ones, the kind where neither person is performing disagreement but actually believes they are right, and sometimes she was wrong and sometimes he was wrong and neither of them ever acknowledged it in words, but you could see it in the way they adjusted. In the way the next session incorporated whatever the previous argument had surfaced. He was 25 now, and he had become something remarkable in the pack, a warrior of reputation, feared by rivals and relied upon by his father in ways that went beyond combat. He had learned, somewhere along the way, to apply the same disciplined methodology to strategy that he applied to training, and the combination was formidable. He treated her like she was someone who could keep up with him. She worked, every day, to deserve it. The closest they ever came to anything resembling tenderness was the evening after her first real fight, a border skirmish, nothing planned, wrong place wrong time, and she had handled herself but badly, and had come back with a split lip and a bone-deep shakiness she was working to hide. Roan looked at her face, said nothing, disappeared, and came back with clean cloth and a small pot of salve, which he handed to her without looking at her, because he knew, she understood this, that looking at her in that moment would have been too much. You telegraphed your right side, he said. I know, she said. Fix it. I know. A pause. Then, you didn't break. She understood this was, for him, the fullest version of well done. No, she said. He nodded once. He left. She sat with the salve in her hands for a long time after that. With Eli, It was different. It was books and late nights and a particular quality of conversation that she found nowhere else in the pack, where she didn't have to simplify a thought before she offered it, didn't have to worry that precision would read as coldness or depth as pretension. He was working on something, had been working on it for 2 years by now, a compilation of pack lineage records that went further back than any existing official document. She hadn't asked him directly if this was related to the questions she'd raised about her own family. He hadn't said directly that it was. But he had started asking her, periodically, questions about details she'd mentioned years before. The surname crossed out above her family's entry. The patrol her father had been on. The border conflict that decade. He asked carefully. He noted everything. He had her trust entirely, and he handled it with the seriousness it deserved. The thing she valued most about Eli was that he never made her feel that the truth was a thing to be managed. Other people, even ones who cared about her, sometimes softened information at the edges, slowed its delivery, determined what she was ready for. Eli operated on the premise that she was ready for whatever was accurate, and that treating her as otherwise was a kind of condescension dressed as protection. She found this more comforting than any amount of gentleness would have been. Caden was the one that took the longest. He was 30 by the time it shifted, and it shifted not through conversation or gesture or any single moment she could have predicted, but through a council meeting. She had been permitted to attend, not as a member, not yet, but as an observer, a formality that the elders had granted grudgingly and that she treated as the gift it was. The dispute was over a border territory that a neighboring pack had been quietly encroaching on for 6 months, and the council was divided between two responses that she could see, with uncomfortable clarity, were both wrong. She should not have spoken. She was an observer. Observers did not speak. She spoke. She laid out both positions, the weaknesses in each, and then offered a third, not a compromise but an entirely different approach that reframed what the pack actually needed from the outcome and worked backward from there. She did it in 2 minutes, clearly and without apology, and then she stopped talking and looked at the table. The silence lasted long enough to be uncomfortable. Then Caden said, "Run it again." From the reframe. She looked at him. He was looking at the table, not at her, but his attention was fully present. She could feel it, the particular quality of his focus when he was taking something seriously. She ran it again. The council adopted the approach. It worked. The encroachment ceased within the month. Caden never mentioned it directly. But he stopped looking past her. He started looking at her, not warmly, not even comfortably, but as a peer processes another peer, seeing, accurately, what is actually there. For him, she understood, that was everything. Dane was 23 and she was 19 and they still hadn't had a conversation longer than 10 minutes. But he was always there. At the edge of things. Present in the specific way she had learned to recognize as his, slightly removed from the main current of any gathering, never fully absent, watching with those sharp eyes that took everything in and gave very little back. He still left things at her door sometimes. A book she'd mentioned once in passing. A piece of fruit from a tree she'd said she liked, the previous autumn, a detail she had fully expected him to have forgotten. He never forgot anything she said. She had come to understand that this was not accident or coincidence. That paying this quality of attention to her was a decision he made, repeatedly, while working very hard to make it look like something that wasn't deliberate. She never called him on it. She left things at his door sometimes too. Just occasionally. Nothing significant, a drawing she'd done of the training yard at dawn, once, because she knew he was out there alone most mornings and she thought he might like to see it as someone else saw it. A piece of the bread she'd made badly and knew he would eat anyway without comment, because she had observed that Dane had no interest in pretending imperfect things weren't worth having. He knocked on her door the morning after the bread. "The bottom was burnt," he said. "I know," she said. A pause. He held her gaze for a moment, the longest he ever had, direct and unguarded in a way that was briefly, startlingly different from his usual armor. It was still good, he said. He walked away. She leaned against the doorframe and breathed slowly and thought that Dane was going to be the one she worried about the most when things got hard. She was right. The threat came from the north in the 43rd year of the Alpha's rule, and it came fast. A rival coalition, 3 packs moving in coordinated formation, which spoke to planning and resources and a confidence that suggested someone had told them the timing was right, that Iron Veil had a vulnerability worth pressing. They hit the eastern border at dusk and the northern watch post before midnight, and by the time the full picture was clear, the pack was operating in emergency conditions with 3 separate defensive fronts and not enough senior warriors to cover all of them cleanly. The Alpha coordinated from the hall with 2 elders and a map table and the controlled, total calm of someone who had weathered worse than this and intended to weather it again. Roan was at the eastern front within the hour, because that was where the heaviest force was concentrated, and Roan went to the heaviest force the way water goes to the lowest ground. Caden took the northern watch post, command of the defense, 36 warriors, the kind of structural crisis management he had been trained for since adolescence. He was good at it. He was, all things considered, extraordinary at it. Eli was in the hall, at the Alpha's elbow, running the intelligence, tracking movements, cross-referencing reports from the field, identifying the pattern beneath the apparent chaos, because there was always a pattern and Eli could always find it. Dane was supposed to be at the southern perimeter, which was considered the most secure position, held back because of his age and relative inexperience. He was not at the southern perimeter. He was at the northern watch post when it was overrun. She didn't know this until afterward. At the time she was moving through the eastern corridor of the pack settlement, guiding civilians, children, elders, non-combatants, to the secure interior of the main hall, a role she had claimed without being assigned it because someone needed to, and she was there and she knew these corridors better than almost anyone. She found Dane when everything had already gone wrong. He had taken a hit, not fatal, she assessed that before she even reached him, because she had learned to assess these things, but bad enough that he was moving on sheer stubbornness rather than function, pressed against the wall of the watch corridor with blood on his shoulder and a look in his eyes that told her the stubbornness was running on reserves. She took his weight without asking. Got him moving. I was handling it, he said. You were bleeding on a wall, she said. I was handling it quietly. She almost laughed. She did not have time to laugh. She got him to the interior hall and handed him to one of the healers and turned to go back, and he caught her wrist. He didn't say anything. He just held on for a moment, long enough that she understood it for what it was. Then he let go. She went back. It was Caden who blamed her when the post fell. Not without reason, she was honest enough to see that. Her ability had activated in the corridor when the worst of the push came through, that silver-blue luminescence rising in her hands as she moved civilians through a collapsing situation with a speed and accuracy that should not have been possible, and it had drawn attention. Eyes she didn't want. A report filed by one of the senior warriors that reached Caden before she'd had time to think about its implications. He found her in the hall the morning after, when the coalition had been repelled and the immediate crisis was contained and the damage was being tallied. He stood across the room and the anger on his face was not the hot, chaotic anger of someone surprised, it was the cold, precise anger of someone who had been building toward this for a long time and had simply found the moment to release it. You drew them to the corridor, he said. Whatever you did, whatever that was, they felt it. 2 warriors tracked it directly. We lost ground because of where they moved. She did not flinch. I know. Then you understand why you can't. I understand that I got 11 people to safety who would not otherwise have made it. She kept her voice level. I understand that I have no control over something I don't fully understand yet. And I understand that you have been looking for an argument for 9 years and you have finally found one you believe is legitimate. The silence between them was sharp. That's not. It is, she said. I know you, Caden. I have been watching you for 9 years. This is not about the corridor. Something moved behind his expression. Something complicated and tired and, she thought, possibly honest. It should have been one of us, he said, finally, low. The one who found him. The one who saved him. It should have been one of his own sons. Not someone from outside. It was never supposed to be you. She held his gaze. She understood the grief in it, the old, particular grief of someone who had wanted to be enough and had been present for every opportunity and still been arrived at second. I know, she said gently. I know that's what you feel. But Caden. I was there. He was hurt. And I would do it again. He looked at her for a long moment. He looked away first. He didn't apologize. He wasn't built for it, and she didn't need it. What she needed, what she watched for in the days that followed, was the slower, harder movement of someone renegotiating a belief they'd held for most of a decade. It came. Slowly. In the particular way things come from Caden, without announcement, without ceremony, visible only in the adjustments. It came. He told her on an evening in late autumn, 9 years after she had first walked through the gate with a tin bucket and an adoption document and no idea what was waiting for her. He told her in the small kitchen, at the table that was just for the two of them. There was tea. There was firelight. He had, she realized, chosen the setting deliberately, the most ordinary place in the house, the place that felt most like home, because what he was about to say was going to make the ground move and he wanted her to have something solid around her when it did. She sat across from him and waited. He placed his hands flat on the table, a gesture she had never seen from him before, something almost like steadying himself, and he began. Her parents had not come to the border by accident. Her father had been a ranked member of a pack that no longer existed, dissolved, dispersed, its records systematically removed over a period of years beginning just before Sarah was born. The pack had been small but old, with a bloodline that carried something the outer packs had spent generations trying to map and never fully managed to, a lineage that predated the current council structure, that appeared in records going back further than most of the current noble families could trace their own names, and that carried, in its oldest branches, a quality that the scholarship called latent leak in resonance and that in plain language meant the kind of gift that had expressed itself, 9 years after the fact, in silver blue light in a training yard. Her parents had known. They had hidden her at the border deliberately, in plain sight, under a changed name, because someone had found out what she was and had decided it was a problem. That someone, the Alpha told her, had been on the pack council. He had been on the council for 15 years. He had voted on her adoption. He had sat at the same table as the Alpha through years of pack decisions and border disputes and ceremonial functions. He had removed the administrative record from the archive. He had silenced the witnesses. He had arranged, long before Sarah was born, for her father's patrol to cross into territory that was not safe at a time that was not accidental. The Alpha had known for 3 years. He had been building the evidence carefully, the way he built everything, slowly, irrefutably, until there was no room left for the truth to be argued around. Why didn't you tell me? She asked. Because knowing would have changed how you moved through this house, he said. And I needed you to move through it exactly as you had been. Naturally. Visibly. I needed him to believe that we didn't know. He paused. I'm sorry for that. It was a calculated decision. I won't pretend it wasn't. She sat with this for a long moment. The firelight moved. The tea cooled. You knew about my family, she said slowly. Before you adopted me. I had suspicions, he said. I had fragments. I didn't have enough to be certain. He looked at her steadily. But I knew that whatever you were in danger. And I knew what kind of person you were. Those two things together were enough. She understood, then, why he had come back to the shed with adoption papers. Not only gratitude. Not only what he had seen in her face by firelight while she nursed his wounds in the rain. There had been something deliberate in it, a decision to put her somewhere visible, somewhere protected, somewhere that made her difficult to remove quietly. He had used the adoption to protect her. He had also meant every word of it. Both things were true. She held them both. The man on the council, she said. What happens now? He met her gaze. That's what the council meeting tomorrow is for. She walked into the great hall the following morning and took her place at the center of the floor, and this time she understood why she was standing there. The Alpha Council was assembled. The 6 elders. The senior nobles. And on the far end of the curved table, the man, gray-haired, unremarkable-looking, with the practiced stillness of someone who had spent decades perfecting the appearance of having nothing to conceal, who had decided, 20 years ago, that her family was a threat to be eliminated. He looked at her across the hall without expression. She looked back at him the same way. Caden was standing to the right of the chamber. He had read Eli's compiled records 2 nights prior. Eli had come to him directly, had laid the documents out on the table in the strategy room without preamble, and what had happened in Caden's face when he finished reading was something Sarah had not been present for, but that Roan had described to her afterward in the sparse economy of language he used for things that mattered. He put the documents down and he didn't say anything for a long time, and then he said her name and asked where she was. He stood in the chamber now with the particular alignment of someone who has resolved something internal. He was looking at the council table, not at her, but when she walked in, he turned, just briefly, and met her eyes. He nodded once. She nodded back. Roan was at the door. When she passed him he said nothing, but his hand dropped briefly to her shoulder, there and gone, a second at most, and she understood it as the fullest version of "I'm here" that he was capable of. Eli was near the record tables, the compiled documentation organized with meticulous precision, ready to be entered into formal evidence. He looked at her over the heads of the elders and gave her the small, certain nod of someone who has done everything he could do and believes it is enough. And Dane, she found him last, standing near the back wall where he always stood, at the edge of things, slightly removed. He was watching her with those sharp, unguarded eyes that he usually kept so carefully controlled, and what was in them now was not complicated. It was simple. It was the simplest thing she had ever seen on his face. He was not afraid for her. He was certain of her. She breathed. The Alpha rose. He did not begin with accusations. He did not begin with the evidence. He began, as he always began, with everything, at the root. He told them about a patrol gone wrong. About a pact dissolved. About a child left at a border in the rain with a changed name and no protection except her own extraordinary stubbornness. He told them about a night 9 years ago when an Alpha had been left for dead, and about the one person in the world who had stopped to help him. He told them what he had found. He said the name of the man at the end of the table. The room changed. The man did not deny it. She had expected him to, had prepared for it, had been ready for the smooth, practiced deflection of someone with years of experience at managing the room. But he looked at the Alpha across the hall and something in him seemed to decide, very quietly, that it was finished. He sat back. He folded his hands. He said, she was never supposed to survive long enough to matter. The hall erupted. Sarah stood at the center of it, perfectly still, while the noise broke around her, elders rising, voices overlapping, the crash of a chair. She stood still the way she had learned to stand still when she was 10 years old in a shed at the edge of the world, when she had made peace with the fact that the noise of other people's reactions was not the same thing as the truth of a situation. She had survived long enough to matter. She looked at the Alpha across the chamber. He was already looking at her. It was over by midday. The council ruled with a unanimity that surprised no one who understood what the documentation had contained. The man was removed from his seat, from his rank, from the pack record. The formal proceedings were clean and swift, the way Ironvale handled things when the Alpha had already decided the shape of the outcome and had simply waited for the process to catch up. Sarah stood in the courtyard afterward in the pale autumn sunlight and felt the strange, hollow quiet of a thing being finished. She had lived inside this question for years. Inside the not knowing and the careful searching and the weight of understanding that something significant was being kept from her and that she had to trust the person keeping it. She had lived inside the gap between who she was and who she might have been, between the shed at the border and the room with the window, between a child who had no one and a young woman with, she let herself feel it now, finally, fully, a family. They found her one at a time, the way they always did things, individually, in their own rhythms, on their own terms. Ron came first, because Ron moved toward things directly when he had decided to move toward them. He stood beside her for a while without speaking, looking at the same middle distance she was looking at, and then he said, "You held up." "Yes," she said. "In there, I mean. You held up when it counted." "I know what you meant." A pause. The particular comfortable silence of two people who have stood beside each other in enough difficult moments that silence has stopped needing to be filled. "You always held up," he said quietly. Correction offered freely, without requiring a response. She didn't give one. She didn't need to. Eli came with the compiled records under his arm, already thinking about where to file them, what annotations needed adding, how the pack's formal history would have to be amended now that the truth had a place in it. But he stopped when he reached her and stood for a moment doing nothing administrative at all. "Your family's name," he said. "The original one. It's in the oldest records. It's a significant name, Sarah." She looked at him. "I thought you'd want to know that," he said. "That they mattered. That they were known. That you come from something real." She found that she had to look away for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "For all of it. Everything you did." He adjusted the records under his arm. "You would have found it yourself eventually," he said. Which was the most generous thing Eli knew how to say, and she received it that way. Caden was the last of them to come to the courtyard, and when he did he walked slowly, with the deliberate pace of someone who has made a decision he is not going to unmake. He stopped in front of her and he stood there for a moment and she let him take the time he needed. "I was wrong," he said. 2 words. For Caden, they cost more than a speech. "I know," she said. "Not about everything," he said, with enough of his characteristic precision that she nearly smiled. "There are still things about the situation that I think required more caution than." "Caden." "Yes. I know," she said again, gently. "And you were wrong." Something shifted in his jaw. A release of something he'd been holding for a long time. He nodded. "You're a good advisor," he said. It came out stiffly, but it came out sincerely. "You'll be a good one for whoever leads this pack." She understood what that cost him to say. "So will you," she said. "You'll be a good alpha." He looked at her for a long moment. Something complicated and old and finally, she thought, at rest. He held out his hand. She took it. She found Dane where she always found him when things had been heavy, not at the edge of the courtyard, not at the training yard wall, but at the old oak at the far side of the settlement grounds, the one with the low branch he'd climbed as a boy and still returned to when the world required thinking through. He was sitting with his back against the trunk, not climbing. Just sitting. She sat beside him. Neither of them said anything for a while. The light was going gold and long across the grass the way it does in late autumn when the days are getting short and every hour of warmth feels like something worth noticing. "You're going to be fine," he said eventually. "I know," she said. "I'm not saying it for you." He paused. "I know you know. I'm saying it because I needed to say it." She looked at him. He was looking at the light across the grass. "I was so angry when you came," he said, quietly, the way he said things he meant, with all the armor removed, carefully, like it was a deliberate act. "I know I didn't say that. I didn't say anything. But I was angry. You were so fine with everything. With being thrown into this house, with learning everything from nothing, with all of us being what we were to you. You were fine. And I wasn't fine about anything. And you being fine made it worse somehow. She was quiet. Then somewhere along the way, he said, you started being the thing I came back to. When it was bad. I don't think I ever told you that. You left bread at my door, she said. He looked at her. I knew, she said. I always knew, Dane. He looked back at the grass. His jaw moved. Good, he said. It came out rough. They sat together until the light was gone. The Alpha found her last, as the courtyard lanterns came on and the pack settled into its evening rhythms around them. He walked slowly, as he had begun to walk these past 2 years, not with difficulty, but with a changed relationship to speed, the particular pace of someone who has decided that arriving was never the important part. He sat beside her on the low stone bench near the hall entrance. She looked at him, the silver at his temples gone fully white now, the lines of his face deeper, the gold of his eyes as clear as the first morning she'd seen them in the shelter, looking up at her from the ground of a forest he shouldn't have been lying in. I've been thinking, he said, about that storm. So have I, she said. I have thought about it almost every day since. He was quiet for a moment. I was not supposed to be there. I had gone out alone, against protocol, against every instinct I'd trained into myself over 40 years of leading. I went alone because I was tired, and because I wanted 1 hour of being no one's alpha. He paused. I nearly died for it. Yes, she said. And instead, he said, I was found by a 10-year-old girl who had every reason to keep walking and no reason at all to stop. He looked at her. The pack believed, for a long time, that I had rescued an orphan from the border. That I had brought you in from nothing and given you something. She met his gaze. You know that's not what happened, he said. I know, she said. Because she had known it for years, the version of events that the pack had slowly, finally, arrived at understanding. That the night she knelt in the mud beside a dying wolf with nothing but a strip of torn cloth and steady hands, she had not simply saved one man. She had set something in motion. Had started a chain of events that had brought a hidden enemy into the light, had given 4 brothers something to become, had given a pack a kind of reckoning it had been building toward for decades. She had walked into this family with nothing, and she had changed its shape entirely. They called you my orphan, the Alpha said. 4 years. You were the girl I brought in. He shook his head slowly. But you were never that. You were never small. Not even at 10 years old, alone in a storm, with no reason to be brave. His voice was low, and she could hear in it the depth of 9 years of watching and knowing and being certain he had done the right thing. You were the one who saved us, Sarah. All of us. In more ways than any of them have fully counted yet. She sat with that for a moment. Then she leaned her head, very slightly, against his shoulder, a thing she had never quite done before, and that required nothing, and that he received by simply staying exactly as he was, solid and still, the way he had always been. The lanterns burned around them. The pack moved in its evening patterns. Somewhere across the courtyard, she could hear Roan running a late drill, the rhythm of it, the counted beats, and Eli's voice in the library window above them, reading something aloud to himself, and Dane's footsteps on the path that ran past the old oak, returning. And Caden, somewhere inside, doing what Caden always did, preparing. Thinking ahead. Carrying the pack in his mind, the way he'd been taught to, the way he would do for the rest of his life. Her family. The girl who had once talked to a dying wolf in the rain because there was no one else to talk to, and had never imagined, as she did it, that she was choosing this, all of this, every complicated, difficult, irreplaceable piece of it. She had chosen compassion in the dark. Everything else had grown from there. The pack believed the Alpha rescued an orphan that day. But years later, they would realize the truth. She was the one who saved all of them,